Hey, it's Evan. It was really good to see most of you last week for our Zoom lessons. Thank you everybody for coming along. So obviously we don't have one of those this week, but I will see you again next week. And today you are going to be following on from what we were talking about and kind of building some more of this context for our last big story of the year, which is Henry VIII versus the Catholic Church. So, last lesson, you found out all about Henry. Henry, what kind of man he was, what kind of person he was. So, we know what he's up to. Now, let's look at what the church is up to so that we can then see how those two stories come together. So, today's title is Why Did People Begin to Criticise the Church? Okay, so could we get that into your books nice and underlined? Then your first task is going to be a gap fill. So we did the importance of the church just before Christmas. We've kind of kept coming back to it. We looked at how John fell out with the church, how Becket and Henry, how they were involved in this conflict, and we looked at the Crusades and how the Pope sent, millions of people from Europe all off on this crazy mission to the Holy Land. So let's remind ourselves why that church was so powerful. So you've got two options here. You've got this document on Show My Homework. Okay, it's a gap fill. Notice these are the words you need to use. Now you can either print this off and fill it in. Okay, that's the easy option. Or if you can't print it, you're going to need to copy it out for me and just fill in the gaps as you go. All right, now these words obviously aren't in the right order, but cross them out as you go. And I've put an answer document on Show My Homework so you can check your answers afterwards if you're not sure about any of them. Okay, so that's task one. Task two is to get down these keywords. Now, Pope and Catholic Church, we kind of know those already, but I thought it was worth just reminding ourselves what those two things are. The key one today is reformer. Okay, a reformer is someone who wants to make changes, they want to make reforms. Normally, a reform is something, a good thing, it's meant to be an improvement. So, for instance, a few years ago, they reformed the GCSEs, so they're no longer A star A, B, C. You now have a 9, 8, 7. So there's more different grades, and supposedly it's better now. Okay, so that's kind of the key thing we need to learn about today. And a monastery, just to remind you again, we do know this one, is a place where monks live and work. Okay, so a building where they devote their lives to God. All right, so you need to get these words and their definitions into your book, please. Okay, so before I get on to task three, I am going to give you a little quick introduction to this topic. So, as I say, what we're looking at this half term, between now and summer, is the argument between Henry VIII and the Church, the Pope. Okay, an argument that actually, for once, Henry's going to win. We've seen Henry II, he fell out with the Church over Becket. He lost that argument. He had to be whipped. We saw John. He fell out with the church over who should be the next archbishop. They wanted Stephen Langton. He didn't. In the end, the church won. John had to give in. Okay, so every argument we've seen so far, the church has won. The story of Henry VIII is the story where the king wins. Okay, now, as I say, Henry is not the only person that is disagreeing with the Catholic Church by this point. So he doesn't come up with the idea of falling out with the Pope. The man who came up with the idea of getting rid of the Pope and getting rid of the Catholic Church and making it better, reforming it, is this man here, whose name is Martin Luther. Now, a lot of you have probably heard of Martin Luther King, who is a black civil rights activist in the 1960s. He is named after Martin Luther, but they are different people. Okay, so Martin Luther, he lived in the 1500s. Okay, he lived in a place in Germany, in a place that is now called Wittenberg. Okay, so this is a map of Germany. That's where it is. Okay, now he was a monk. Okay, he studied religion, he studied theology, and he decided that he didn't agree with what the church was doing for lots of reasons. Okay, that we'll talk about more in a minute. He thought the Catholic Church was wrong. He thought it needed to be changed, it needed to be improved, it needed to be reformed. So he is what we would call a reformer because he wanted change. And the way he kicked this all off is he went to his local church in the town of Wittenberg, 1517. Okay, and he wrote a massive list of 95 things he didn't like about the church. And he went into the middle of the town to the church door and he nailed it onto the door so that everybody could see. Now, that was a really brave thing to do because obviously at the time, if you disagreed with the church, you risked being burned alive at the stake as a heretic. So Martin Luther was a really brave man to do this, but he really felt very strongly that the Catholic Church was wrong and it would therefore be upsetting God. Okay, so he wanted it to be reformed, he wanted it to be changed. And the big thing that is behind all of Martin Luther's thinking was that all that you need to do to go to heaven is believe in God. Don't need to do anything else. All you got to do is believe. Everything else is a distraction. Okay, so he looked at a lot of the things the Catholic Church was doing and he thought it was unnecessary. He thought it wasn't in the Bible, he thought it should go. So, for instance, you can see this very visually here. Okay, so this is what a Catholic church at the time would look like. Very colourful, lots of statues and paintings, and the priest in a really sort of funky outfit. It's a colour everywhere, statues, pictures, gold, decorations, really sort of bright, special place. Martin Luther thought that was unnecessary. He thought that was a distraction. He thought it was silly. He wanted churches to look like this. Okay, so a lot plainer, simpler, no pictures, no colours, a much simpler outfit for the priest. All right, no need for all of this ceremony and fancy incense burners and colours. He didn't think any of that was necessary. He thought it was a distraction. Similarly, another thing Martin Luther really didn't like was the fact that in the Catholic Church, the Bible is in Latin. Okay, so that's the language the Romans wrote and spoke in a long time before. Okay, but even though the Romans weren't around by this time, the church still used Latin. Okay, so even though most people in England spoke English, or a form of it, when they went to church, it would still be in Latin. So most people would go to church, they would see the service happening down the front in all this decoration and pageantry, and they wouldn't have a clue what was being said. They wouldn't understand a word of it. Okay, because it would all be in Latin. They didn't speak Latin. And the Bible was in Latin too. So if you weren't a priest, who were the only people that could really read Latin, you couldn't read the Bible. You just had to take the priest's word for it, which obviously gave the priest and the Pope a huge amount of power. And Luther didn't like that. He thought, no, everybody should be able to read the Bible. Everybody should understand what's going on. It should be in English, or whatever language you speak. So in Martin Luther's case, it was German. The other thing that really Martin Luther didn't like was this practice the church had got into called selling pardons. Now, we've talked a lot this year about the fear of hell and how people would pretty much do anything the church told them to because they were so scared of going to hell. Now, they take this to kind of a new level, okay, by the time Martin Luther's around, so by the sort of 1500s. And what they've started doing is selling bits of paper called pardons. So here's an example of one, supposedly signed by the Pope. And if you bought one of these bits of paper, you bought one of these pardons, you would be forgiven for your sins and you would go straight to heaven. So it's a way of buying your way into heaven, basically. Now, of course, why is the church doing this? Well, simple answer, money. Right, the church was a very wealthy organisation, but they were also quite a greedy organisation. And by selling these bits of paper, supposedly signed by the Pope, you can see him doing it here, the church made absolutely loads of cash. Because lots of desperate people who didn't want to go to hell would basically pay whatever they asked to buy one of these pieces of paper. So Martin Luther didn't like that either, and he wanted that to be got rid of. He thought that was not acceptable. He thought that was the church behaving in a really greedy and exploitative way. So that's not the only thing he wanted to get rid of. Okay, and what we're going to do now for your final big task today is you are going to look at everything else Martin Luther wanted to change. So what else did he want to get rid of from the church? So I've given you some headings. Number one, selling pardons for sins. Okay, that's what we were just talking about. He didn't want them to do that. Okay, he thought that wasn't okay. And what you're going to do is I'm going to give you the headings, but you're going to use the information sheet to add a reason next to each heading. So why did he not like this practice? So you've got a sentence starter. This was criticised because. So if we start with this was an example, here's the heading, selling pardons for sins. You draw an arrow to that, and you're going to use this sheet here to explain why Martin Luther didn't like it. So if you look at the top one, a pardoner was someone who would sell pardons for sins, blah, 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 blah. Okay, you would read that, and that would give you your answer. Okay, so you can say, this was criticised because the reformers believe that you should pray for forgiveness, pray, not pay. Okay, so you can use that information sheet to write your explanations. So I'm going to give you all the other headings you need that you can draw on your mind map. So people having to send taxes to Rome, the Bible being in Latin, colourful paintings and statues in churches, monasteries owning lots of lands and money, praying to the saints rather than directly to God, because in the Catholic Church, supposedly God is too busy to hear what ordinary people are doing, so they say pray to the saints instead. And then finally, the Pope having total power. So these are all the things that Martin Luther wanted to get rid of. Okay, he wanted to reform, he wanted it gone. And what you have to do next to each of these headings, and I'd like you to give yourself a full page, is write an explanation. So use this information to find the correct box, okay, and explain why he didn't like these things, and use this sentence starter. This was criticised because. So here's your example. There's the heading. We found out what he didn't like about it. So we did a little arrow. This was criticised because, and then we've explained it. Okay, and like I say, I think you need a full page for this. Okay, because I want you to include detail. So for each of these headings, what did Martin Luther not like about it? Why did he criticise each of these things? Okay, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in our next lesson. Okay, if you have any questions, send me an email. I'm very quick to reply. Okay, so I'm sat at my computer all day these days, so I'll be right there. Okay, let me know if you're stuck, and I will see you all very soon.